My name is Naomi Carter. I'm 31 years old, and until the week my family's lawyer read my mother's will, I honestly believed heartbreak came in stages. First the shock, then the grief, then the silence. I was wrong. Sometimes it all hits at once. My mother left me a ruined cabin on the big island of Hawaii, the kind of place most people would bulldoze without a second thought. The other inheritance went somewhere else, to a life of polished marble floors, ocean views in Miami, and everything that looked like success from the outside. By that night, the man I was supposed to marry dropped my ring on the table, looked me dead in the face, and called me a pathetic loser. Then he walked out and chose the side of the family that had already made it painfully clear where I ranked. I wish I could tell you I cried or begged or made some dramatic speech about loyalty. I didn't. I booked a one-way flight to Hawaii, drove across black volcanic roads under a sky that felt too quiet, and stood in front of that broken cabin with one suitcase and a rage so deep it almost felt clean. The windows were cracked, the porch sagged, and the whole place smelled like salt, dust, and old secrets. I thought my mother had left me there to be forgotten. I thought that cabin was proof that in the end, even she had chosen someone else over me. But the first night I stepped inside, I found something hidden beneath years of rot and neglect. And in that moment, I realized the worst part of my story wasn't the betrayal. It was what happened after I discovered exactly why that cabin had been left to me. Before I tell you what I found in that cabin and why it turned my entire family against itself, tell me this. What time is it where you are right now? And where are you watching from? Because I really want to see how far this story reaches. By the time I turned 13, I understood something I wish I had learned much later in life. In some families, the child who asks for the least slowly becomes the one everyone feels safest disappointing. My parents never said they loved Sabrina more than they loved me. They did not have to. Love shows itself in patterns, and our house was built on them. If Sabrina forgot an important deadline at school, my mother called teachers and fixed it. If I forgot something, I got a speech about responsibility. If Sabrina wanted a new dress for an event, my father found a reason to approve it. If I needed money for a field trip, I was asked whether it was really necessary. The strange part is that I defended them for years. I told myself they were just trying to keep peace. I told myself older daughters got more attention because they were louder and harder to manage. I told myself it did not matter because I was strong enough to handle disappointment. But strength gets expensive when everyone around you keeps spending it. When the family money improved after my grandmother Eleanor Hale passed away and left a complicated trust connected to land on the Big Island, the gap between Sabrina and me widened in ways that became impossible to ignore. My parents upgraded the house. Sabrina upgraded her life. I upgraded my ability to stay quiet. She got the car with the better trim package because she needed to make a good impression. I got the used sedan later because it was still reliable and I was practical. She built a following online before most people her age even understood what that could become. I built a resume. She learned lighting, angles, captions, and how to make every brunch look like a private event. I learned how to manage time, stretch a budget, and sit with families going through things no amount of money could fix. When I left for college, I paid attention to every scholarship deadline like my life depended on it, because in some ways it did. I worked part-time, then full-time in summers, then part-time again while finishing my degree. Sabrina floated between brand partnerships, stylish apartments, and dramatic stories that always ended with someone else cleaning up the real mess. My parents called her exciting. They called me stable. Exciting gets celebrated. Stable gets used. Even then, I wanted us to be a real family. I flew home for holidays. I bought thoughtful gifts. I remembered anniversaries. I sat through dinners where Sabrina dominated every conversation with follower counts, hotel openings, and people my parents had suddenly become desperate to impress. Then I would get asked how work was going, and before I could answer properly, the topic would swing back to her latest trip or her newest deal. The worst part was that my parents were not cruel enough to make it obvious. They were subtle. They were polished. They were the kind of people who could wound you while still sounding supportive. "You are just different," my mother used to say with that gentle voice of hers. "You do not need the same kind of attention." Maybe she believed that. Maybe it helped her sleep. I built my life in San Diego because it was one of the first places where I felt seen for who I actually was. I worked as a program coordinator for a nonprofit focused on education access. My days were full of grant deadlines, school partnerships, parent meetings, emergency food vouchers, tutoring schedules, and small victories no one posted online because they were too real to be pretty. I loved it. I loved being useful in a way that actually mattered. I loved helping kids who were told not to expect much from the world learn that effort could still open a door. I loved proving that care and competence still had value, even when people with louder lives got more attention. Then Ethan walked into that world and made me believe I had finally found someone who respected it. At first, he did. At first, he looked at me like purpose was beautiful. He asked questions about my work and actually listened to the answers. He remembered details. He sent coffee to my office when I had long days. He offered to help with fundraiser strategy and never made me feel small for not wanting the kind of life people show off online. When he proposed after 3 years together, I said yes because I thought I was saying yes to a man who understood the difference between success and value. I did not know yet that some men admire a woman for being grounded only until they find another woman who can make them feel taller. The first year I was with Ethan felt calm in the way real happiness often does. It was not flashy. It was not loud. It was Saturday morning coffee, grocery lists on the counter, shared playlists in the car, and the kind of conversations that make you believe you are building something solid rather than just performing it. He worked in product strategy for an agri-tech company that loved words like disruption and innovation. But when it was just the two of us, he seemed tired of performance. He said I was the first person who made him feel like he did not have to impress anyone. I should have paid more attention to the fact that he said that so often. People who are obsessed with being seen eventually get angry at the person who met them before they were finished inventing themselves. At first, my family liked him because he was polished, educated, and ambitious in a respectable way. My mother liked that he knew how to speak to donors and executives without sounding awkward. My father liked that he could hold a conversation about infrastructure and sustainability. Sabrina liked that he looked good in photos. Back then, I laughed about that. I even trusted them around each other. That trust feels embarrassing to think about now. Ethan and I got engaged quietly. No elaborate surprise, no rooftop violin player, no camera hidden in a flower arrangement. Just dinner, a long walk, and a simple question that felt sincere. I love that. I thought it meant we were choosing substance over spectacle. For a while, that still seemed true. Then his career started accelerating, and with it came a version of Ethan I had never fully met. He began traveling more. He spent more time around investors, founders, and people who talked like everything in life was a pitch deck. He started measuring time in opportunities instead of days. He began talking about scale, access, premium circles, and what kind of room we should be trying to get into. I noticed the shift slowly, the way you notice a crack in a wall after pretending for weeks that it is just a shadow. He became more restless with my routines, less patient with the parts of me that had once seemed to calm him. He used to say he loved that I was grounded. Then he started calling me cautious. He used to say my work mattered. Then he started asking whether I had ever considered doing something bigger. Bigger meant richer. He rarely said it plainly at first, but it was there. Then Sabrina moved to Miami full-time and her brand took off in a way that made my parents act like they had raised a celebrity instead of a woman who rented half her image and all of her charm. Suddenly, every family conversation included her follower count, her partnerships, the restaurants she was seen in, the people who reposted her. Ethan paid attention in a way I did not like, then in a way I could not ignore. He began asking more questions about her. He started praising how strategic she was. He said she understood visibility in ways most people did not. He said the world rewards people who know how to position themselves. I remember one dinner in Los Angeles when we were all together and Sabrina arrived late in a white outfit that looked too expensive to sit comfortably in. She walked in already talking, already laughing, already making the room orbit her. Ethan watched her the way men watch a version of life they think they should want. That was the first night I felt something cold move through me. It was not jealousy. It was recognition. After that, the comparison started. Not all at once. Ethan was too smart for that. He layered them in gradually, almost gently, like he wanted me to help him disrespect me. He would say Sabrina understands how people work. He would say Sabrina knows how to take a room. He would say, Sabrina thinks bigger than most people. Once, after I turned down a job opportunity that would have doubled my salary but moved me away from the students and families I had committed to, Ethan looked at me across the kitchen and asked if I was ever going to stop choosing meaningful over successful. I asked him what he thought success meant. He did not answer right away. That should have told me everything. By the second year of our engagement, he had become impatient with the life we used to call ours. He wanted a better zip code, a stronger social circle, a faster climb. He wanted the version of ambition that comes with witnesses. Sabrina fed that part of him every chance she got. She complimented his instincts. She laughed at his jokes longer than necessary. She told him he was wasted on small thinking. She said it in front of me once and smiled as if we were all in on the same harmless game. We were not. I tried to hold us together because that is what women like me are trained to do. I planned dinners. I suggested weekends away. I started blaming stress, work, travel, anything but what was right in front of me. I wanted to believe that men do not usually drift toward your sister while still sleeping in your bed and asking what you want for dinner. Then my parents disappeared after leaving Hawaii, and whatever was left between truth and performance in my life collapsed overnight. The call came on a gray Tuesday that already felt wrong before I knew why. I was at my desk in San Diego reviewing a funding proposal for a literacy program when my phone lit up with a Los Angeles number I did not recognize. The woman on the other end introduced herself in the careful tone people use when they are trying not to detonate a stranger's life too quickly. She told me there had been severe weather over the Pacific. She told me my parents' small charter flight leaving Hawaii had run into trouble. She told me there had been an emergency loss of contact, an incomplete recovery of information, and a search effort complicated by terrain and storm damage. The words reached me in pieces. By the time I understood them, I had already stood up so fast my chair hit the wall behind me. I do not remember packing a bag. I do not remember driving to Los Angeles. I remember the freeway blurring. I remember pulling over once because my hands were shaking too badly to trust the lane lines. I remember calling Sabrina and hearing music in the background before she finally answered. She sounded shocked for about 10 seconds, then focused. That is the only word I have for it. Focused. Not heartbroken. Not disoriented. Focused. By the time I got to Los Angeles, my mother's friends were already calling, my father's colleagues were already texting, and Sabrina was already talking about managing the narrative because people online had started asking why she had canceled a brand dinner in Miami at the last minute. The next 2 weeks felt like living inside paperwork and grief at the same time. There were meetings with lawyers, updates with vague language, forms no daughter should have to sign, while still hoping someone might walk through the door and make all of it unnecessary. I handled most of it because I always handled most of it. Sabrina flew in and out between appearances, calls, and what she called commitments. Ethan came with me at first to appointments and memorial planning meetings. He held my hand. He told people I was stronger than anyone knew. Then, little by little, he drifted. He stopped staying the night. He started taking calls in other rooms. He looked at his phone too often. Grief sharpens some truths and numbs others. I sensed him moving away from me before I fully understood how far. The memorial was small because there was still uncertainty, and because I could not bear the idea of turning pain into a public event. Sabrina disagreed. She wanted something bigger, cleaner, more visible. She kept saying people needed closure. What she meant was people needed content. Then came the reading of the will. We sat in a quiet office in Los Angeles across from Margaret Holloway, the attorney my family had used for years. The room smelled faintly of paper, leather, and cold air conditioning. Margaret's expression gave away nothing. She read every line with professional calm, and each sentence felt more unreal than the one before it. Sabrina was left a mansion in Miami valued at $1.2 million, along with liquid assets and select investment accounts. I was left my grandmother's old cabin on the Big Island, a neglected structure on protected land with limited development rights and a maintenance history that made it sound more like a burden than an inheritance. I remember staring at Margaret like she might suddenly laugh and admit this was incomplete. She did not. Sabrina exhaled slowly, then lowered her eyes in a performance of humility so polished it almost impressed me. I walked out of that office feeling like someone had reached inside my chest and rearranged every memory I had of my mother. That night, Ethan came to my apartment. He did not sit down right away. He stayed standing, which I realize now was because he had already decided not to stay. He told me he did not know how to build a future with someone who had been handed a decaying cabin, while the real future had clearly gone somewhere else. He said I had spent my whole life accepting too little and calling it integrity. He said I was too comfortable being overlooked. Then he set my engagement ring on the table and looked at me with a kind of disappointment that only cowards feel when someone else fails to become useful enough. He called me a pathetic loser. Those were his exact words. I still remember how quiet the room was after he said them. He left before I could answer, and by the following weekend, he was in Miami with Sabrina. I found that out the same way everyone else did, through a smiling photo she posted from a rooftop restaurant with the caption about unexpected chapters and choosing the life that feels meant for you. I did not cry. I booked a one-way flight to Hawaii. The cabin was worse than the legal description had suggested. The porch sagged. One window had been boarded from the inside. Salt air had chewed through metal fixtures. The inside smelled like old wood, dust, mildew, and years of being left behind. I spent the first day cleaning because if I had sat still, I might have broken apart. On the second night, while pulling a warped storage trunk away from the wall in what used to be my grandmother's room, I noticed a section of flooring that sounded hollow under my weight. I pried it open with the back of a hammer and found a sealed metal box tucked beneath the boards. Inside were documents. Not cash, not jewelry. Documents, trust assignments, patent filings, licensing structures, correspondence with attorneys, land use memoranda, handwritten notes from my grandmother and mother, and one summary valuation that made me sit down so hard the dust lifted around me. The intellectual property and land control framework tied to a sustainable agriculture and water resilience portfolio had an estimated value exceeding $300 million over time. I read it 3 times because my brain refused to accept the number. Then I kept reading and realized something even bigger. This was not just wealth. It was leverage. It was legacy. It was the kind of thing that, in the wrong hands, could be stripped, sold, and turned into the exact kind of exploitation my grandmother had spent years trying to prevent. That was the moment my grief changed shape. I still felt abandoned. I still felt betrayed. But now I also understood that my mother had not left me nothing. She had left me something powerful enough to destroy every person around me if they found out the wrong way. I should tell you, I made one mistake, and only one. I kept the documents secret, which was the right decision. But I underestimated how cruel people become when they sense there is something hidden near them that might be worth money. I came back from Hawaii with the box sealed inside my carry-on and locked it in my apartment closet behind old files and winter clothes. I did not call a broker. I did not contact any company. I did not even make copies. I read through everything at night and tried to understand what my grandmother and mother had built. The patents were linked to sustainable growing systems, water retention technology, and long-term licensing structures designed to protect Hawaiian agricultural land from being swallowed by the kind of development that turns heritage into branding. The more I learned, the more certain I became that I could not let Sabrina or Ethan anywhere near it. Not because I wanted it all for myself, but because I knew exactly what they would do. They would sell the parts that glittered and pretend not to notice what died in the process. I was still deciding how to protect everything properly when I agreed to attend a small remembrance gathering in Los Angeles for my parents. I should have skipped it. I know that now. But grief makes you hungry for even the possibility of tenderness, and I kept hoping some part of my family might still be worth reaching for. The gathering was held in a private room behind a cafe my mother used to love. It was simple: coffee, tea, small plates, framed photos, soft music no one really heard. I wore black. I arrived early. I set out name cards because no one else had thought to. That detail alone should tell you what role I had always played in that family. People came in waves: friends from my mother's hospital years, colleagues of my father, 2 cousins who actually hugged me like they meant it. Then Sabrina arrived late in a cream suit that looked like it had been chosen for a magazine shoot about tasteful grief. Ethan was with her, one hand on the small of her back, as if he had been standing there all along. For a second, the room actually tilted. She kissed the air near people's cheeks and accepted sympathy like she had trained for it. He avoided my eyes until he did not. When he finally looked at me, there was no shame in him. That was the part that hurt most. Shame would have meant he still understood what he had done. Instead, he looked relieved. The speeches started. A few people shared warm stories. I spoke briefly about my mother's patience and my father's quiet discipline. My voice almost broke once, but I held it together. Sabrina spoke next and somehow managed to make 2 dead parents sound like a branding lesson in resilience. People nodded because polished women are rarely interrupted when they are lying beautifully. Afterward, while everyone drifted into small conversations, Ethan approached me with Sabrina beside him. She asked whether I had settled into the Hawaiian dump yet. He said I should probably be grateful I had gotten anything at all, considering how little faith my mother had clearly had in my ability to handle serious assets. I laughed once because rage sometimes comes out sounding almost calm. Sabrina smiled and said maybe the cabin was symbolic. Maybe it suited me: small, broken, hidden away from anything important. That should have been the moment I walked out. Instead, I made the mistake of trying to defend my dignity in front of people who had already decided I did not have any. I said they had no idea what had really been left to me. Ethan smirked. Sabrina leaned closer and asked what that was supposed to mean. I said, too sharply, that the rundown cabin they were mocking held something worth more than all the marble and bank accounts they were congratulating themselves over. The room did not go silent dramatically the way it happens in movies, but something shifted fast enough for me to feel it. Ethan's expression changed first, not confusion, calculation. Sabrina stared at me for half a second, then laughed in a way designed to sound dismissive while she filed every word away. I tried to pull back. I said nothing else, but it was done. By the next morning, she had moved. I still do not know whether Ethan fed her details from old conversations or whether she built the whole thing from instinct and greed, but within 48 hours, the story had spread through relatives, family friends, and then online. The version people heard was that I had discovered hidden inheritance documents and was keeping them from the family. Sabrina framed herself as the daughter trying to ensure fairness. Ethan framed himself as the man who had stepped away after realizing I was dishonest. I was painted as secretive, bitter, unstable, and greedy in a matter of days. Then the internet did what it does best. It made the ugliest version of the story entertaining. Posts showed up speculating about a hidden fortune on Hawaiian land. Comment threads filled with strangers deciding what kind of daughter hides family assets after a tragedy. Sabrina began posting vague videos about betrayal, truth, and what happens when quiet people are not actually innocent. Ethan appeared once in the background of a clip, just long enough for people to identify him and start treating them like some glamorous couple who had survived my dishonesty together. My phone became a source of dread. Relatives I had not spoken to in years called to advise me to do the right thing. Old family friends sent patronizing messages about transparency. One aunt asked if I had really thought I could keep something that valuable to myself without consequences. Then the legal notice arrived. Sabrina was suing me for concealment of family assets and misuse of trust-related property. She had hired a high-end attorney in Los Angeles. Ethan was prepared to provide supportive testimony. I sat at my kitchen counter reading the filing while the coffee in front of me went cold. That would have been enough. But greed was not satisfied with the courtroom. A week later, someone broke into the cabin in Hawaii. A local caretaker called me after checking the property and finding the side door forced open. Drawers had been emptied, floorboards had been damaged. Whoever went in had been looking for something specific. I flew back and stood inside that cabin feeling sick. My grandmother's old furniture had been shoved aside. Papers from a locked chest had been torn and scattered. They had not found the documents because I had already taken them. But that did not make the violation feel smaller. It made it feel personal. Someone had not just gone after property. They had gone after the one place my family history still felt real. My work noticed the strain. I stopped sleeping properly. I missed details. I started arriving early just to sit alone in my car and try to calm my breathing before staff meetings. My director was kind, but concern has a way of sounding like distance when your life is unraveling. I was asked to take temporary leave while everything settled. That phrase made me laugh out loud after the call ended. Nothing in my life was settling. By then, Sabrina and Ethan were posting from Miami as if justice were already on their side. They looked tanned, rested, and vindicated. I looked like a woman learning what isolation actually means, not being alone. Being surrounded by people who want a version of you to fail, so the story they chose becomes easier to believe. When the court date was set, I thought I had finally reached the bottom. I had not. The bottom was still waiting for me in that courtroom, along with the only thing that could have been worse than losing everything: finding out why it had all happened. The morning of the hearing, Los Angeles looked offensively normal. People were buying coffee, honking at lights, walking dogs, checking parking meters, living inside ordinary problems while I was stepping into a courthouse to defend myself against my own sister and the man who had once promised to marry me. I wore the navy suit I usually saved for donor meetings and school board presentations because I needed to remember who I was before my life became someone else's spectacle. My lawyer was competent but not glamorous, which suddenly felt fitting. Sabrina arrived looking as if she had hired the building to flatter her. Ethan was beside her in a tailored suit, all clean lines and controlled expression. If you had not known the story, you would have assumed they were the reasonable ones. That is the danger of people who know how to package themselves. They enter the room, looking like the conclusion. Inside the courtroom, the air was cold enough to keep everyone alert. Sabrina's attorney opened with a polished statement about hidden assets, family trust obligations, and my alleged effort to conceal documents that materially affected inheritance fairness. The language was clean. The accusation was ugly. I was portrayed as the overlooked daughter who had finally decided to punish everyone by hoarding a discovery worth hundreds of millions. Ethan was referenced as a witness prepared to speak to my secrecy and instability in the weeks after the will reading. I sat there and listened to my life being translated into the kind of story greedy people need in order to feel innocent. When my lawyer stood up, he argued what he could: that the inheritance structure was more complex than Sabrina claimed, that there was no evidence I had sold, transferred, or exploited anything. That speculation and suspicion were not proof. It was decent work, but even I could feel the imbalance. Sabrina had confidence, performance, and a narrative people wanted to believe because it made money look like destiny. I had restraint, caution, and the exhausted face of someone who had spent months being attacked for not behaving dramatically enough. Then Ethan was called. Watching him take the stand felt stranger than any part of the hearing before that. He looked calm. He looked almost thoughtful. He spoke about my emotional state after the will, about my isolation, about comments I had made regarding what was hidden in the cabin. He left out his betrayal. He left out the ring on the table. He left out the fact that he had moved into my sister's orbit almost before my side of the bed had gone cold. He spoke like a man giving context, not like a man helping build a weapon. Sabrina watched him with quiet approval, and for one brief second I saw their future clearly. Even if they won, they were never going to survive each other. People that hollow eventually run out of mirrors. The judge had just asked a follow-up question about the inheritance documents when the courtroom doors opened behind us. It was not a dramatic slam. It was a simple sound: hinges, movement, attention shifting. But every head turned anyway, and when mine did, I stopped breathing. My parents were standing in the doorway. For a few seconds, nothing in the room made sense. My mother looked thinner than I remembered and older around the eyes, but unmistakably herself. My father stood beside her, straighter than he had any right to after the months we had believed him gone. Margaret Holloway, the family attorney, entered behind them with an expression that looked almost human for the first time since I had seen her. Sabrina went pale in a way I had never thought possible on a woman so committed to controlled appearances. Ethan actually took half a step back before he realized everyone could see him. The judge called for order, but the room was already in a different reality. My mother was sworn in first because she insisted on speaking. Her voice shook at the beginning, then steadied. She explained that the flight from Hawaii had encountered severe weather and been forced into an emergency landing in a remote area that triggered a chain of communications, legal confusion, and medical isolation I will not pretend I fully understood even while she was describing it. What mattered was this: they had survived. They had been recovering. And before the full correction process was completed publicly, a decision had been made with Margaret to continue withholding that truth for a limited time because my parents already suspected something they had never been willing to test openly. They believed that if the appearance of inheritance imbalance were introduced, the people around me would reveal exactly who they were. I did not know whether to cry or scream at that point. Relief and fury are closer cousins than most people realize. My father spoke next. He admitted that the will Margaret had read was not the final binding distribution document, but a controlled instrument created to reveal motives and behavior under pressure. The Miami mansion allocation to Sabrina had been temporary theater. The derelict cabin assignment to me had been deliberate. Not as punishment, as trust. The documents in the cabin were real. So was their value. My father said he and my grandmother had spent years building legal protections around the land, licensing structures, and intellectual property because they believed the long-term future of Hawaiian agricultural resilience mattered more than a quick sale or flashy family wealth. My mother looked straight at me when she said they believed I was the only one who would stop long enough to understand the difference between owning something valuable and deserving the right to control it. The courtroom was silent in a way I will never forget. Not performatively silent. Human, silent. The kind that happens when greed gets stripped of costume in public. Margaret then produced records showing that no final transfer of the core assets had ever legally vested in Sabrina. Additional records showed that my parents had monitored attempts to pry into the cabin and had reason to believe outside pressure had increased only after rumors about a hidden inheritance started circulating. Sabrina's attorney tried to recover. Ethan's face had gone blank. My sister finally stood up and asked my mother how she could have done this to her. Not to us, to her. That one sentence told the truth more cleanly than any evidence package. She was not devastated that her parents had nearly died. She was devastated that the test had not crowned her. Ethan tried once to say he had only been acting on what he believed was legitimate concern. The judge shut that down almost immediately once the sequence of events became clear. The lawsuit was dismissed. The allegations collapsed. Sabrina's expression changed from outrage to fear when she understood dismissal was not the end. It was the beginning. Because once the official correction was entered and the false public narrative unraveled, every sponsorship statement, every insinuating post, every legal claim, and every whisper campaign would point back to the same ugly source. Not me. Them. I did not stand up and deliver some clever speech. I did not need to. The truth had walked into the room on its own 2 feet. Still, when the hearing ended and people started moving, I turned to Ethan because some part of me needed to see whether anything human had survived inside him. He looked at me with the stunned expression of a man who had just watched the ladder he was climbing turn out to be painted on a wall. He said my name once. I kept walking. My mother reached for my hand in the hallway and started crying before I did. My father apologized in a voice so low I almost missed it. I wish I could say that fixed everything. It did not. It fixed the question of whether I had been wrong about my own worth, and after a lifetime in that family, that was not a small thing. The public correction came fast because it had to. Once the court record reflected the truth, the story Sabrina had been feeding people began collapsing under its own weight. My parents released a formal statement through their attorneys first, then a shorter personal statement that was shared widely enough to reach the same corners of the internet that had enjoyed tearing me apart. They explained that they were alive, that the will narrative had been temporary and incomplete, that false claims had been made about me, and that the core family assets tied to the Hawaiian land and intellectual property had never been available for casual division or opportunistic exploitation. It was not flashy. It did not need to be. Truth sounds different when it no longer has to beg for attention. Once the correction hit, everything Sabrina had built on implication started turning against her. Brands do not mind shallow people. They mind unstable liability. Her management team dropped her within days. At first, she tried to frame herself as misunderstood, then manipulated, then traumatized. But the problem with living online is that your old captions become witnesses. Clips resurfaced. Vague posts about betrayal were stitched next to the official statement clearing my name. Comments turned vicious in the way only digital audiences can. The same people who had once flooded her posts with praise began calling her performative, greedy, and cruel. Contracts were paused, then canceled. Event invitations disappeared. Followers dropped so fast she stopped posting for nearly 3 weeks, which for Sabrina was the closest thing to public disappearance I had ever seen. Ethan's collapse looked different but hurt him just as deeply because his identity was built around being taken seriously by ambitious people. His company placed him on review once his testimony, personal involvement, and apparent conflict of interest became impossible to separate from the public scandal. Internal messages came out during follow-up legal review that made him look even worse. He had discussed potential licensing scenarios tied to the Hawaii documents before he had any lawful right or ethical basis to do so. He had not just been disloyal, he had been opportunistic in writing. The startup let him go. Suddenly, the man who had once looked at me and called me too small was sending carefully worded messages through mutual contacts, asking whether I would be willing to clarify that he had just gotten caught up in family confusion. I never answered. He did try once directly. He sent a long email at 2:14 in the morning saying he had been under pressure, that Sabrina had manipulated him, that he had made the worst decision of his life, that he saw now what kind of woman I really was. I read the first half, then deleted it. Some apologies are not repentance. They are just panic looking for a softer place to land. Sabrina and Ethan did not last much longer after that. People who bond through betrayal almost never survive exposure. Once the money, image, and upward fantasy were stripped away, they were left alone with each other's character. That is a short relationship. As for me, I spent the first month after the hearing doing something I had not done in years. I got quiet on purpose. Not because I was hiding, but because I wanted to hear my own thoughts without everyone else's greed crowding them. My parents and I had difficult conversations, the kind real families avoid until life leaves them no polite exit. I told them what their patterns had done to me over the years. I told them that surviving a plane incident did not erase the damage of a lifetime of imbalance. My mother cried more than once. My father did not defend himself as much as I expected. For the first time, they seemed less interested in looking like good parents than in understanding whether they had actually been any. That mattered, not because it erased the past, but because accountability is the only soil where trust can grow back into anything worth keeping. Eventually, the final structure of the inheritance was clarified. Legal control over the protected land framework, licensing direction, and associated intellectual property was placed under my authority with strict preservation provisions. In simple terms, I had the power to decide how those assets would shape the future. I knew right away I would never treat them as a jackpot. That was never the point. I worked with legal and environmental advisors in Hawaii to strengthen the land trust protections and make sure short-term profit could not devour long-term responsibility. I created a foundation using a limited portion of the licensing revenue. One branch funded education access programs in California and Hawaii for students from under-resourced communities. Another supported sustainable agriculture training and local stewardship initiatives tied to the land my grandmother had spent years protecting. It felt right. Not clean, because nothing about the path there had been clean, but right. The cabin on the Big Island was repaired slowly and carefully. I kept as much of its original structure as possible. The porch no longer sagged. The windows no longer rattled in every gust. The smell inside changed from mildew and neglect to cedar, salt air, and coffee in the mornings. It became a place where history did not feel like a burden anymore. It felt like responsibility chosen on purpose. My parents visited with me the first time the repairs were truly finished. My mother stood in the kitchen and cried quietly at the counter. My father walked the property line in silence, then came back and told me my grandmother would have approved of what I had done. That meant more to me than I let him see. I am not going to tell you the ending is that my family became perfect, because that would turn this into fiction too clean to be useful. The real ending is better than that. I stopped chasing love from people who only knew how to offer approval when I was easy to ignore. I stopped confusing endurance with peace. I stopped believing that being good meant being willing to disappear for other people's comfort. What I learned from all of this is something I wish every person who has ever been underestimated by their own family could hear early. Money does not build character. It reveals it. Status does not create values. It exposes whether you ever had any. Education, empathy, integrity, and responsibility to something larger than yourself are what endure when the image burns off. The most valuable thing my mother left me was not hidden under the floorboards of a ruined cabin in Hawaii. It was the final proof that I had been right to protect what mattered, even when everyone around me was calling me naive for doing it. And if there is any lesson worth carrying from my story, it is this. Never let people who worship appearances convince you that your quiet principles are weakness. Sometimes the people who look smallest in the room are the only ones strong enough not to sell what should never be for sale.